You're listening to the Sticks in the Six podcast. Here are your co-hosts, Andrew Forbes, Peter Barricini, and Alex Hobson.
Had 13 points, 10 goals. Came to Toronto on a very friendly deal, 79 games, 23 goals, 63 points, and as we mentioned, up for the Calder Trophy. Now, this is his final year of the deal. We're talking about what's next for Michael Bunting on a team where he's very constrained when it comes to the cap situation. Obviously, we know in 2025-26, the cap's going to take a major jump. But, Alex, there's been talk about a possible 8-year deal for this guy. Just to clean up the AAV a little bit for him. Is Michael Bunting a guy you want to give an 8-year deal to?
I'm probably the wrong person to ask this question because I am a bigger Michael Bunting fan than most. So bias is kicking in a little bit right here. But I do want him in Toronto long term. You know, I think, and this is something that maybe people overlook in when it comes to players and taking hometown discounts and stuff. I think the fact that Michael Bunting, whenever he's been asked about his contract negotiations, it's always been something to the effect of, I love Toronto. I'm a Toronto boy. I want to be here. And I know that all players say something to the effect of that.
It's home to Austin Matthews as well.
Yeah, it's honest. Yeah, true. It is home to Austin Matthews. They're roommates.
Yeah.
But you know, when you consider Bunting's story about how he's a Scarborough boy, Leafs signed him for less than what he probably could have commanded in free agency last year. And the one thing that stuck out to me as well was the quote that came out today when he said something along the lines of, I would like my agent, my team to start negotiating something mid-season. That's not something that you often see. Most of these guys wait to the offseason to start planning out their next contracts. But the fact that Bunting is already willing to have his contract negotiated, season hasn't even started yet, like T-minus 2 hours, obviously. But it's just one of those things where when he talks about wanting to be here and wanting to work out the details, when he's already thinking about his next contract and the season hasn't even started, that tells me that he wants to be here. And in my opinion, you're looking at a guy who, I think a lot of it's going to depend on whether or not he can repeat his success from last year. I know you had a take on that as well. I think as long as if he can hit 60 points again and play that role of the pest, you know, get into the middle of the scrums, maybe draw some penalties. He drew a lot of penalties last year, if I recall correctly.
Top 3, I think.
Yeah, he was top 3 in the league. So I think he's a guy that the Leafs should do everything they can to keep. And over 8 years, you know, I think it would be amazing if the Leafs could get him to a similar deal to what Victor Arvidsson got in LA. I know he's not signed for 8 years, I don't think, but Arvidsson's making, I think, $4.5 million per year. And, you know, with Alex Kerfoot's contract being off the books this year, that's $3.5 million you can put towards Bunting. And obviously there's going to be some other players that aren't returning next year. So I think the salary cap the Leafs will be able to make it work with the money that they have. I hope that they can get it done in that range of 3.5 to 4.5, maybe 5 million. I told Peter before we started recording that I'd go as high as 6. And I think that's maybe, like I said, maybe
with
a little
the cap
bit of
going up. You never know.
Yeah, well, that's the thing.
Yeah.
Like I said earlier, the cap is supposed to be going up.
Keyword supposed.
Yeah, you can't rely on the NHL for things like this. But
yeah,
if the cap goes up and you have the room to make it work, I think Bunting's one of those guys that it would be really nice for the fans, for the marketing purposes, and obviously for the team's purposes to have Bunting there long term. You saw what he did with Matthews and Marner last year. Like, a lot of great teams in hockey have had a line. You know, you look at Pittsburgh in their cup runs. They had that what was it? Hagelin, Bonino, Kessel, the HBK line. Obviously, you got you had the kid line in Tampa Bay when they made their run to the Cup final. Like Tyler Johnson, Andre Palat, and Kucherov. You've got Boston's top line: Marchand, Bergeron, Pasternak. You know, a lot of teams have a line like that. And I think Bunting is, based on last season, I think he did enough to cement himself into a role on that line. But again, a lot of it's going to depend on if he can repeat his success this year.
So you mentioned it. I wrote an article about how he can, you know, repeat his success in his second year with the Leafs. A while back, I also wrote a piece about how Hyman was the 5th role or centerpiece to the core of the Maple Leafs when he was obviously still with the Leafs. Is it a stretch to say that Michael Bunting is now the 5th core piece to that line?
So he's now essentially the next Zach Hyman. I know that's a debate that everyone does not want to get into, but you know what?
I would love to get into it because I got some number crunching here that I will throw your way.
I can confirm you guys, everybody watching right now can't see what's on Forbes' MacBook, but he's got cap friendly pulled up.
Yeah.
So he's about to make
Thank
it.
you. It is cap friendly.
I just want to say that is an interesting comparison for Victor Arvidsson to Michael Bunting's next contract, because everyone is saying Nick Paul with his 3.15 million contract, which makes sense money wise, but obviously
Nick Paul's career high in points is 35.
But that's what I'm saying. Yeah. Michael Bunting had a far superior offensive season than Nick Paul. There's no doubt about that. But if Nick Paul Michael Bunting was able to settle on that $3 million, great. But if you're able to get him maybe in that 4.5, like Alex mentioned, that's going to be a steal for 8 years. And even so, even if you think that that's a bit of a risk, considering the last 3 years, that's when he's on his decline or he's out of his prime, that's still a contract that's movable. It's not over 5 or over 6 where you need to retain salary. That's going to be a deal that could pique a team's interest where they need to get to the cap floor if he's on the decline, only if. But the way that he's played right now, the way that he stayed relatively healthy too last season. So if he's able to maintain that, play with that edge, play with that intensity, and I believe we saw him on the power play being that net front presence. But if John Tavares is back and he bumps down to the second, still maintaining that presence in front of the net is going to be huge. And he barely got any power play points last season. Majority of his production was 5-on-5. So if he's able to up that penalty power play time and get producing there, even mid-season, if they still think that 4.5 is great for Michael Bunting, it's going to be great for both sides. Bunting gets his increase. The Maple Leafs get a cap-friendly deal that tailors to them cap-wise, and you still have money to play with Marner, Matthews when they become free agents. Tavares may take a hometown discount as well because he may not be worth $11 million anymore. So even if you even give him up to 5, who knows what can happen? But it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out because, a lot of talk was around that Nick Paul kind of deal. Sign him right now before he pops off again for another 60-point season. That way you have him for 3.5 for the next 8 years. That's going to become even more of a steal, especially in years 3, 4, 5, 6.
I'm really glad that you mentioned the little power play shift that they're doing with Tavares bumping down to the second unit and Bunting on the first, because I think
that was just because of the injury. But if that is the case, then it's still going to be great.
I hope they stick. I hope they stick that way though, because if you notice, a lot of last season, the Leafs used their power play 1 unit for like 3/4 of the penalty kill. PP2
a good minute 20.
PP2 would come out and they'd have like the last 30, 40 seconds or whatever to score a goal. But the point is that power play unit number 1 and power play unit number 2 were not getting deployed equally.
Yeah.
So I think that Tavares moving down to the second unit is a really good move for the Leafs if they do that, because the second unit's not going to have Jason Spezza anymore. And Tavares is a guy who I think that with the remaining, I guess you want to call them the remaining characters. I don't know who would round out the second power play unit this year. Maybe Kerfoot, Matt Malgin. Yeah. Kerfoot, Malgin. I think it's good. I think it'd be good for them to have a veteran to sort of keep the power play in check and like make it so that it's not just a bunch of chickens with their heads cut off running around. And Tavares is a guy who we've seen in the past. He never, during most of his tenure with the New York Islanders, he never really played with star players all that often. He was often with a couple of guys who were good for maybe 40, 50 points a year. So it's not like he needs to be on that first unit with Matthews and Martin to produce. You put him in the bumper spot. He's a guy that can shoot still. He can be your guy in front of the net. I think he's better fit on that second unit, and maybe that way the Leafs don't have to put all that extra pressure on the first unit to get something done. They can sort of deploy him a little more equally.
I'm going to throw some numbers at you, and this is strictly for the comparison with Zach Hyman. Michael Bunting, 63 points in 79 games last year, just 7 power play points. Zach Hyman, who's earning 5.5 AAV over the next 6 seasons now, but he signed for 7 seasons in Edmonton. 54 points in 76 games last season, with 15 of those points coming on the power play, playing with McDavid and Draisaitl. So
10 of those points. Sorry, I think that says power play.
Oh, sorry, you're right. 10 points. So that considered, I mean, this is obviously Bunting is a guy that can command $5.5 million. I guess my thinking is, and I've never been a fan of the long-term contracts. I like, you know what, you sign for 2 years, you earn your next contract. Right now, the NHL is so devoted to paying for what you expect them to do.
Yeah.
And if you expect a guy like Bunting to put up 65 points every season, then yeah, I guess give him 7 years at $5.5 million. Sure, absolutely. But if Bunting's a guy that could have two really good seasons over the next 2 years, maybe 70 points, maybe 75 points, and then he's going to drop off after that second year, then no, I don't want to sign him to 8 years and maybe have a guy that you got to bury at some point or buy out, and then it goes against your cap. Right now, the Leafs have a clear cap when it comes to bought out players.
Mm-hmm.
You want to keep it that way, right? So you don't want to sign these long-term deals unless, of course, we're talking about Austin Matthews, which then, give him the bank, drive him over to the
Back up the
TD
brink
over
check,
here,
blank check,
and just back it right up and give him whatever the heck he wants.
Mm-hmm.
But Michael Bunting, for me, he's a slot-in player. He's a guy that you slot into that line, and he's going to make that line better. He's going to be the guy that goes into the corners, just the same way a Marchand is in Boston. And that's not to take away anything from Marchand. He plays well, but he's a slot. You can slot somebody else into that spot. They're probably going to have similar success. So, I mean, 8 years kind of a stretch for me, but I wouldn't mind getting something done now. Maybe in the 5-year range, 5-year, 5.5, 6 million. I wouldn't be opposed to that. And then you're not locking yourself up long term with a guy that has had one full season in the NHL.
Yeah, well, like I said before,
it could be a Matthias Samuel situation where you just sign 7 years,
the
30
Buffalo
million
special.
after 54 games.
The Buffalo special.
Yeah, that is the one thing. I think a lot of what will come of this extension will depend on how he does this year, because you want to prove that this season wasn't just a flash in the pan. But I mean, it's kind of hard to predict him having a down year playing alongside Austin Matthews, who scored 60 goals, and Mitch Marner, who was well on pace for 100 points last year. So I do agree that, if you're giving him 5 to 6 million, somewhere in there, 8 years is a little much, but I would be more than happy locking him up for 8 years if it was like 4 or 4.5.
Yeah.
Be totally happy with that.